James Paterson is chair of the Federal Parliament's Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security. Today it holds its first hearing on an inquiry into alleged Chinese interference in Australian universities. Senator Paterson, welcome back to Breakfast.
Good morning, Fran. Thank you for having me.
Can we look at the case of Ted Hui? He fled Hong Kong in 2019 after he was charged with national security offences. He's currently in quarantine in Darwin. He flew in from London. And he's the first opposition politician to be granted a travel exemption by the Morrison government. Is that a deliberate message to Beijing that Australia is prepared to do what it can to help the pro-democracy campaign in Hong Kong?
Well, Australia's been very outspoken rightly about the way in which the Chinese government has not lived up to the promises that it made to respect the autonomy and freedom of Hong Kong and its people. But I don't think we should overinterpret or overread Australia's decision to welcome Ted Hui as a visitor. And in fact, in some ways, this perfectly illustrates the problem in the relationship with China that arises from time to time. What we regard as a purely domestic sovereign issue for Australia, our immigration policies and which visitors we choose to welcome or not, the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party regards as interfering in its domestic affairs. I have to say, to put it politely, that's a fairly expansive definition of domestic affairs. It's a fairly extraterritorial definition of domestic affairs. I think any genuinely independent observer who looked at this would say, why would Australia's immigration policies be a domestic issue for the Chinese government? And what
I think the Chinese government's talking about rule of law, isn't it? It sees it differently. It says this man was a fugitive from the law. Have we given safe haven to a criminal? That's the way they're saying it.
Well, he hasn't actually come to Australia from China or even Hong Kong. He's come from elsewhere. And why should someone coming from the United Kingdom, for example, to Australia be a matter for the Chinese government? Why should the Australian government hand over control over its immigration policy to any foreign government, the Chinese government included? This is solely a domestic matter for Australia, a sovereign matter for Australia. And no self-respecting government, left or right, Labor or Liberal, could ever allow a foreign government to dictate to us those sorts of things.
Ted Hui says he's going to lobby the government for more support. He'll try to expand the pro-democracy movement from exile here in Australia. Is he welcome to do that?
Well, any Australian citizen is welcome to campaign on any political issue, and in fact any visitor to Australia, whether they're a citizen or not, enjoys all the rights and freedoms that Australians enjoy. They enjoy freedom of speech, freedom of political campaigning, so he's welcome to do that here, just as any other citizen is welcome to do that too. And by the way, citizens or other visitors who have a different view to him are welcome to put their arguments too, and that's the great virtue of an open liberal democracy like Australia.
And the Australian government has helped this man come to Australia. Do you expect that will signal to other activists Hong Kong that they are welcome too? Would you expect more dissidents to apply to come, especially to try and get out before there's a whole raft of new laws coming in that give, one of them would give the Hong Kong government unfettered powers to stop people leaving Hong Kong?
Well, because of the broken promises of the Chinese government, things have changed dramatically in Hong Kong, and I think there will be a lot of people in Hong Kong who'll be looking elsewhere for their future, and we welcome those people with open arms to Australia, not just because we are a place that welcomes people who flee difficult circumstances, but because, frankly, these people have a lot of value to add to Australia. They're highly entrepreneurial people. There are many values in common with the people of Hong Kong and the people of Australia. They have a very strong attachment to many of the liberal democratic features that we have, so I'd be delighted if many more people from Hong Kong chose to make their home in Australia.
And is Ted Hui now going to be given a permanent visa? Can he apply for political asylum? What would you expect?
Well, he has to go through the normal processes that anyone else who wishes to achieve that to go through, and they'll be assessed on its merits.
On another issue, on Saturday, the Prime Minister will take part with the US President Joe Biden in the first ever leaders meeting of the Quad dialogue, which brings together Australia, the US, Japan and India. President Xi Jinping is interested in this, and he's apparently told his military, quote, to be prepared to respond to difficult situations at any time. So this is quite a commentary from the Chinese president, and comes alongside the time that China is noting that the Quad is meeting at a leaders level. Do you think this is a response to the Quad leaders talks?
Well, it's really up to the Chinese government to say whether it is or it isn't, but Australians should be immensely encouraged at the fact that the Quad has been upgraded to the leaders level, and so quickly under the new Biden administration. The Quad really got its life and got going under the Trump administration at the foreign ministers level, but to have a new administration demonstrate its support for the dialogue is really encouraging. It shows actually how bipartisan the consensus is in Washington DC on Indo-Pacific security issues, and it shows what common values and common interests interests we have with India, with Japan and the United States. And it should be encouraging to all countries in the region. I know it will be warmly welcomed by many countries in the region who want to see it to be a stable, secure, prosperous and peaceful region. And
the Prime Minister is situating that way. He said this is another step forward in how Australia sought to keep Australians safe by ensuring we're working with our partners and our allies in particular. And then we've got this comment from the Foreign Ministry, comment from the Chinese president, who's, instructing the military to focus on, quote, combat readiness.
Well, there's nothing that we're doing to contemplate any of those sorts of activities. This is about working together with like-minded countries on a whole range of issues. Yes, absolutely, on maritime security and stability in the region, but also on further working together to combat COVID-19, transnational crime, drug trafficking, all those sorts of issues, climate change. I mean, there is a lot that we agree on between these four countries and that we'll work closely together on.
Suppose I'm saying, has the conversation publicly starting to take a different turn here? And how cautious do we need in terms of how far we push China? It's just announced a 7% increase in its defence budget to $270 billion a year. That utterly dwarfs the $42 billion Australia spends every year, of course. But, do you see this as a change of tone? Public tone in the discussion?
I understand the point you're making, Fran, but what's the alternative? Should we allow foreign governments, any foreign government, China included, dictate to us what our national security policy should be, what our defence policy should be? Or who we meet with?
No, we shouldn't.
No, exactly.
But I'm saying, do you suggest this is a change of tone from China? That's really what I'm asking.
Well, I think there's been a change of tone from China over a longer period of time. I think there's certainly been, under Xi Jinping's leadership, a much more muscular, robust approach to diplomatic affairs. He has pioneered the Wolf Warrior school of diplomacy, which takes a much more aggressive approach to allies. I don't think that's been the wisest path for China and for the Chinese government, but that is a matter for them.
On another issue, your Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security today has its first hearing into the national security risks affecting higher education and research. It'll hear from a number of people, including Mike Burgess, Director General of ASIO. Is it possible to describe how big the threat is that we're facing, and is it mainly coming from China? Is that what you are expecting to hear today?
Well, it's taken very seriously by our security agencies, including ASIO, and really from voices across the political spectrum. We're going to hear from the young student from University of Queensland, Drew Pavlou, today, who I think would describe himself as having a left-wing worldview and has encountered these issues on campus, from Elaine Pearson, who's an academic at the University of New South Wales and the Director of Human Rights Watch in Australia, as well as Alex Joske, formerly at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, all of whom agree that this is a very serious problem and that it poses a real threat to what we want our universities to be open places of dialogue and debate and discussion, where research is conducted with integrity and transparency, and where things funded by Australian taxpayers are for the value of Australian taxpayers and not anyone else.
And beyond that, is there another element to it? If your committee finds, for example, that Australian research is being misused to further Chinese military ambitions or to crack down on minority groups like the Uyghurs, would you be recommending an end to academic cooperation?
Well, I think there's great benefits of international academic cooperation, and we certainly wouldn't want to end all forms of international academic cooperation, but we do want to make sure that it takes place consistent with Australia's national interest and the interest of the taxpayers who ultimately fund it. And I think it's fair to say that over the last 5 years or so, that those risks haven't always been well managed or prudently managed by universities, and some universities in particular have got themselves into difficulty by not being sufficiently diligent about these issues. I think that's changing. I hope that's changing, and we're looking for some good stories out of this as well, the universities that have taken a leadership role in this regard and are making good progress.
It's difficult for them, isn't it? Because it will have serious implications for the financial viability of research at our unis.
Well, it may be difficult, Fran, but again, what's the alternative? Should we allow someone funded by an Australian Research Council grant to also be working under a Chinese government-funded Thousand Talents program? Should we allow them to be filing patents in China for the intellectual property that they generate as an Australian researcher? There are a lot of things which are difficult, but the alternatives can often be far worse.
Senator Paterson, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Fran.
Senator James Paterson is Chair of the Joint Parliamentary Committee on Intelligence and Security. You're listening